Good morning. My name is Colin Ritchie, and I'm just here to talk about my latest article in Canadian Moneysaver on tax-free savings accounts, how to get the most out of your TFSA. I'm not going to go through the article word by word because you can do that yourself, but I just want to give you a quick overview so that when you're reading, things are hopefully as clear as possible and you can actually use the advice to your best advantage. So just to begin, for those of you who aren't familiar with TFSAs, they're one of my favorite tax saving strategies for clients out there. They've been around since about 2008, and each year at this point, clients get about $5,500 worth of contribution room. And if you haven't used this year's, you can carry it forward to next year. And if you haven't used last year's, of course, that room is available for you when you want to make a contribution in the future. For those of you who have never opened a tax-free savings account, if you're doing that before the end of 2016, you have exactly $46,500 worth of contribution room. In other words, you can stroke a check for that amount, put it in your TFSA, and you're off to the races. And of course, if you wait till January 1 of 2017, you've got a New Year's worth of contribution room. And at that point, you would be able to put in $52,000 worth of money if you had never made an TFSA contribution in the past. Why would you want to do this? Well, there's a lot of wonderful benefits for those of you who are looking to save for whatever purpose, whether it's your retirement, purchase of a new house, new car, vacation, or even if you're just using it as a tax shelter with no idea how you're going to be using the money in the future. The first thing to know is, unlike an RSP, you don't get a tax refund from putting money into this. You don't get any deduction. The benefit is once the money's in your TFSA, you'll never have to pay tax on it again as long as it stays there, and you don't have a tax bill to face when you take it out as well. So it lets your money compound a lot quicker than if you have to pay some taxes each year along the way, as is the case if you're investing in your own unregistered account. As a side benefit, it also lets you rebalance your portfolio without having to pay tax in order to sell positions and get the right mix going forward. The other great thing to know about TFSAs is when you pull money out to buy that new car, to pay for that vacation, to make that down payment on your first home, it's not like the room is gone forever. You're credited it back. And when circumstances arise in the future, you get a new job and get a promotion, you get an inheritance, whatever reason that you have fresh money to contribute, not only do you have the room that has been accumulating since you pulled all your money out, but you're able to also replace the amount of your withdrawal. So let's put that into numbers just so things are clear. Let's say you put $20,000 into your TFSA towards the purchase of your new home in 5 years, and when the time comes to actually buy your place, the $20,000 you've put in has grown to $35,000. You pull the $35,000 out tax-free, and you've got your first home. 3 years later, you inherit a bunch of money from a great aunt. Not only are you able to use all the extra unused contribution room that you hadn't used in the past, but you're able to replace the $35,000 that you pulled out for your house. So in other words, not only the $20,000 that you'd put in to grow it to 35, but the full amount of your withdrawal. And that's one of the important things to know about going forward. It's not just the ability to tax shelter money, but it's the ability to take money in and out along the way without being penalized either in tax or loss of room. The one thing to know though is if you do pull money out of a TFSA, you are able to replace it like I talked about, but you have to wait until the next year before you're able to do so. So for the client who pulled out the $35,000, say he did it December 30th, he would have to wait at least the 2 days until he was into the new year before putting the money back. Of course, if he had unused contribution room, he would be able to still put that money in the previous year. Now, when TFSAs were originally created by the government, the banks were all over these, and they seem to have hijacked the process to a certain extent. So they seem to be branding TFSAs as high interest savings accounts, and that's one of the things that really bugs me. And the reason for that, the reasons meant to it, of course, is because they want to make money. But the reason I don't like bank accounts becoming your TFSAs is it's kind of a waste of an opportunity. Your tax-free savings account shelters you from any tax growth. Yes, interest is taxed the most heavily, but you make so little interest from bank accounts these days that it's really immaterial. So my suggestion for your TFSA is going in one of two directions. Either shooting for the moon, owning all those investments that you're hoping will double or triple or quadruple, or having high interest paying or high income paying investments inside your TFSA. Either way, you want to take advantage of the tax savings by putting assets in there that would otherwise be heavily taxed, not things like bank accounts, which are just an afterthought to the tax man these days. Also, another point that you need to consider when you're looking at what to put inside your TFSA is, what's your tax bracket? And the reason I say that is different types of income are taxed at different rates depending on how much you earn. And one of the things that Canadian money savers and investors love, and I do too, are high dividend investments. But that's kind of an unusual situation because clients in lower tax brackets actually get their dividends for free, or in some cases they get a small tax refund. So for example, if you're in BC and you're making about $35,000 a year and are making a few dividends on the side from your Royal Bank shares, let's say you're getting 4% a year, your real return on the 4% dividend payment isn't just 4%, it's 4% plus the tax refund that the dividends create. So it's closer to 4.3%. So if you're looking at putting things into your TFSA, high dividend payers might not be the best solution because you're turning money that is actually already essentially tax-free or even better and putting it into a TFSA where you're in some cases losing a little bit of money because you're not getting the tax refund on the dividends there. So I'm not saying don't do it, but just make sure you know the tax consequences and do it on the understanding that you're doing the tax sheltering for the capital gains on the investments more than on the dividend payments. So if you've got your blue chip darlings and you think they're going to double over 3 or 4 years, don't be too fussed about the dividend payment. You might be a little bit better off keeping it personally, but by sheltering the capital gain that you're hoping to see in 3 or 4 years, it's still a great idea to have those stocks inside your TFSA as well. So to recap, if you open a TFSA, you essentially have the same investment options as you would if you were opening an RSP or a RIF. It's not just a bank account. So scrolling down my article, now that you hopefully have an idea of the basic in and outs of how TFSAs work, I want to give you a few extra tips in order to really let you use TFSAs to your full advantage and your family's full advantage. The first tip is if you're in a family where the husband and wife have vastly different incomes, it makes a lot of sense to have the spouse that's earning more fund the TFSA for both spouses rather than just have each of you pay your own way. The reason for that is, A, there's no attribution. In other words, the government is completely fine with this strategy. It's not going to be taxing anything back to the higher income spouse, but it means it frees up more of the lower income spouse's income and money for other investment purposes. So since the lower income spouse pays a lot less tax on his or her non-registered investments, having that spouse with the extra $5,500 she or he would have by having the higher spouse fund both TFSAs means that the family will save extra money along the way by letting their extra investment money grow that much quicker due to a lower tax bill by having it invested in lower income spouses' hands. The next thing I want to talk about is a little bit ghoulish in nature. And for my younger clients, it's not really something that comes up at all. But the thing to know about TFSAs on death is that if you leave them to a spouse, and we'll talk about the best way of doing that in a second, but if you leave them to your spouse, they get the money they inherit tax-free, but they also get to keep it growing tax-free. In other words, if a spouse dies with $60,000 in a TFSA, if you do things right, the surviving spouse gets to take over that $60,000. And if she has her own TFSA, she essentially can either join the two or have two separate ones. So if she had $60,000 of her own before, it's like she would have the ability to tax shelter $120,000 after her husband passed on, rather than just being stuck with the $60,000 in her own name and having just to take a tax-free check for $60,000 from her husband. That would come to her tax-free, but wouldn't be tax-free after that. So just so I'm clear, if you do things right, not only do both spouses get their own room, but both spouses get to benefit from their existing room even after one dies. Knowing all that, if one spouse is in worse health, is substantially older, or being honest about it, is a guy, since we don't seem to live as long these days, it makes sense if money's tight and it's pretty obvious who's in the worst health, to fund that spouse's TFSA rather than the other spouses. And the reason for this is you only get to take over how much your spouse leaves you at death. In other words, if your spouse has a TFSA for $10,000 when he passes, that's the amount of tax-sheltered money you have to play with going forward from that spouse's TFSA, plus whatever your own TFSA was. On the other hand, if your spouse had maximized contributions, you would be able to keep that TFSA going. You just change the names on it, but you would also have all your own contribution room to use. So if your husband has a big insurance policy, or if you inherit a bunch of money a few years later, you're able to tax shelter a heck of a lot more money. You get to use what your husband's TFSA was at death, but also your own room that you hadn't used. So in some cases, I recommend that clients pull money out of their own TFSA to fund their sick spouses, knowing that they can put money back into their own later. Or even in some cases, it means pulling money out of other sources like registered money, or even borrowing if that's what you have to do, just so you can protect that extra tax sheltering room from beyond the grave. I want to next talk about how to best structure things so that you can do just what we talked about. Now, most people seem to be declaring their spouse as what they call a beneficiary of their tax-free savings accounts. But financial planners are pretty clear that this isn't the best solution. Rather than just naming your spouse as a beneficiary, it's possible to name your spouse as a successor holder. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means essentially that the surviving spouse just takes over the deceased TFSA as is. You don't have to sell the investments. You just essentially change the name on the account. So that's a lot easier for most people. It avoids the transaction costs of having to melt down the deceased TFSA, and it avoids having to be out of the market during the entire process. Because if you just name your spouse as the beneficiary of your TFSA, what will happen will be that the investments in the deceased TFSA will be liquidated. You'll get a tax-free check that you can put into your TFSA, but you will have had to pay transaction costs along the way. You'll be out of the market like I talked about. And it just seems like far more of a hassle than it's worth. Also, there can be some potential tax issues if it takes too long to take money out of the deceased TFSA. After a while, they might start taxing some of the income. So if you use the successor holder designation instead of the beneficiary designation, you take all those risks and hassles off the table. So to recap, successor holder works a lot better for your spouse than naming them as a beneficiary. But if you do use the successor holder designation, you're still free to name somebody else as the beneficiary. And the way things work is if you've named a successor holder, the beneficiary becomes the backup. So if you've got a child, what you might do is your spouse is the successor holder and your child becomes the beneficiary. And that way you've got double coverage. If your spouse is still around when you pass, the money's to her. If not, your daughter or son would get the money. The next thing I want to talk about is how to maximize the tax-free savings that you can get through your tax-free savings account. And that's by not just focusing on your TFSA, but other TFSAs in your family. If you're in a couple, we're talking about something that's probably pretty obvious. That's just making sure that both of your TFSAs are maximized when appropriate. But it's possible to go beyond that as well. Let's say you're in a situation where you've got kids who are in their early 20s, they're still going to school, they're finding their way through life, they don't have a heck of a lot of money to call their own. And even though they're earning TFSA contribution room, as everybody in Canada does when they're 18 or older, it's pretty unlikely that they're actually taking advantage of that. So what you can consider doing is using some of your non-registered money that would otherwise be taxed if it's at a high rate, and using that to fund up your children's TFSAs. In other words, you're borrowing their tax shelter for a little while. And that works well for everybody. It benefits them too in a bunch of ways. First, knowing that they're eventually going to be your heirs one day, it might mean a larger estate for them to divide, because anything that saves you taxes and lets your investments grow more now will probably mean a larger estate for them later. Second, as we talked about earlier, anything you pull out of your TFSA can be put back in. So for the strategy we're talking about, anything that gets pulled out of your child's TFSA can also go back in. So with that example I gave earlier of $20,000 going into a TFSA and growing to 35 over 5 years, let's say that $20,000 was in your child's TFSA. At 5 years down the road, your child has his career going and wants the TFSA room for himself. So at that point, you say, thanks, I'll pull all the money out and off you go. TFSA's rooms all yours again. You pull out the $35,000, the $20,000 you put in, and the $15,000 of growth, and you've saved all this money, but you've also created an extra $15,000 worth of tax sheltering room for your kids going forward. So when funds permit, you've helped them save even more money than would otherwise be the case if they were just making their first TFSA contribution at that time. Another thing to think about when you're funding TFSAs for kids is when they finally get on their financial feet and are in a position where they're able to start contributing themselves, it might not be an all or nothing affair. So in other words, you've been putting a bunch of money into their TFSA each year with the idea that they're going to give it back to you when the time is right. And they're finally in a position to start making their own contributions. Well, say you've put in the $46,500 eligible for 2016, or assuming that they were old enough, or $52,000 for 2017, if you've got a child maybe in their late 20s or so. When they're finally able to start putting money in themselves, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to stroke a check for that much for their first year. It could just be the case that they say, Dad, I'm just going to start making my own $5,500 a year contributions to my TFSA. In that case, you don't have to pull money out right then. It might be just a question of saying, great, you open your own TFSA for your money, and I'll keep this other one, which holds my money, so that you don't get mixed up, and off you go. And 2 years later, maybe they're in a position where they're willing and able to start taking advantage of some of their unused room from the past. Well, in that case, sure, you could melt down the whole TFSA that you've set up in their name. But another option too is just pulling out as much as is necessary to create the room they need to shelter their own money, knowing, of course, that any money you pull out can't be replaced until the next year. So it might be a question of having a conversation every December and saying, okay, what are you planning on doing? You've got 5,500 of new room. Do you need more than that? And if they do, it's a question of pulling money out before the end of December so that on January 1st, all the room your child needs for their own TFSA is going to be there. One question I always get, and it's a very important one, is, well, what happens if something goes wrong in my child's life? What if they have creditors? What if they have a bad marriage? What if, for whatever reason, we have an estrangement? They're doing drugs. For whatever reason, we're not getting along anymore. What can I do to protect the money we've put in? There's a few things to consider as options. One is having the child sign a promissory note every time you put money in. It's not going to protect the growth, but it'll at least help you get the original amount you contributed back. If there's a bunch of other creditors lurking around, it might not be a perfect solution, but it should be good protection if there's a divorce and if there's an estrangement. So that's one thing to consider. The other option is to have yourself named as an irrevocable beneficiary, which is available in BC. I'm not going to speak to other provinces as I just don't know. But if you're an irrevocable beneficiary on your child's TFSA, you're essentially the one who calls the shots. It's creditor protected. No one can put money in or out without your permission or make withdrawals without your permission, and you control all the investment decisions. So you've got things firmly under control in that sort of case. The downside to this, of course, is that it might be too much control. If you ever got sick, that's where problems might arise. It could be that the account is frozen or locked up because as the irrevocable beneficiary, you can't give permission for your child to do anything to the account because you're not legally capable of doing it. You could look at having a power of attorney that you issue that gives somebody that power, but there's a lot of questions as to whether this would be effective or not. So if you're worried about protecting your money, 3 choices. 1, just don't do it. If you're really worried about your child's financial situation or about them just looting the account one day, it might not be the right strategy for you. 2nd, having a promissory note. And 3rd, naming yourself as an irrevocable beneficiary. But on the latter strategy, just be very careful and know what you're getting into. It could be a question of just using that when you're really starting to get worried about your kid's financial situation, putting the irrevocable beneficiary designation on then and maybe taking it off at a later date. Now, kind of a variation on the last strategy. Instead of using your child's TFSA essentially as your own 2nd or 3rd TFSA, it can be a great form of estate planning. So I think far more common, it's the same case where mom and dad give their child enough money each year to fund up their TFSA with no expectation of ever getting it back. So rather than having extra money growing in your hands at your rates, having to worry about probate fees later, estate issues, delays, it's kind of a form of gifting during life in a very tax-effective way. Yeah, it might mean paying some capital gains if you're selling some of your stocks that are in a gain position, but it means creating extra tax sheltering room for your child going forward and letting the money work that much harder for them, since there aren't going to be tax bills that drain off some of the profits along the way. So at this point, I think we're reaching the end of this little talk. Just to recap, tax-free savings accounts are a wonderful strategy and opportunity for clients to put away a few extra dollars for whatever purpose is most important to them. They were largely ignored because they started with small amounts of contribution each year, but investing is a long-term gain, and over the time that's elapsed since these were first created, these small amounts have grown to a total ability to contribute as much as almost $50,000 at once. And if you're taking advantage of other family members, you're looking at $100,000 if you're a couple, essentially, or will be in January of 2017. Or if you're using kids' room as well, you could be looking at several $100,000 if you've got a large enough family. So that wraps things up for today. I just wanted to thank you for tuning